if you really have to go to 0 soul, ideally you still have. So the biggest thing is, one of the things you can run into sometimes with the deck is, I think that balance is like one of the most fun things with Boltyn and one of the biggest things to learn with the deck.
Let's see what can happen in those matchups that players need to avoid.
Into Dromai, you really do need to be... Azalea is tough. The biggest thing going forward is if you want to...
Welcome to the Boltyn Masterclass here at the Fabled Academy. Today, we are taking a look at which mistakes to avoid at all costs with Boltyn. Our guest for this masterclass is Yuki Lee Bender. She went all the way to the top 8 of the Realm Rumble 20k with Boltyn. Yuki, welcome to the Academy.
Thanks for having me on, Alex. Excited to talk with you today about the latest deck that I played at our tournament, Boltyn. He's a lot of fun. And to any of the viewers, if you haven't tried Boltyn or you're curious about how to play him, I'd really recommend picking him up. He's a lot of fun. There's a lot to learn there, and hopefully this will help you get started.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on and letting us know about your experience with Boltyn. But before we start jumping into all the mistakes that can happen while playing Boltyn, tell us, what is your experience with Boltyn before going into the event?
Yeah, so Boltyn was a little bit of a... I wasn't sure what to play. Originally, I was thinking I might play Iyslander if she was still going to be legal for the event, but of course she hit Living Legend. Boltyn is a deck that my team, and in particular Ellie, had been working on quite a bit. She ended up topping the 10k on basically the exact same list, with like one change just to respect Pheano a bit more. That was it. But yeah, it's just a deck that she had been working on for a while, and the biggest problem with Boltyn before was that the Iyslander matchup was really, really terrible, and just having that out of the way made room for him in the meta, and I felt like him being a deck that people aren't that familiar with was also pretty attractive, and I think he's just pretty well-rounded. Like, he doesn't have a lot of really bad matchups. He has some tricky ones, like Dromai is tricky but winnable. I think Azalea is also tricky but winnable. I might need to work on that matchup a little bit more. And the Pheano matchup is, depending on how your deck is built, it can be quite bad for you, but I think if you pack enough sideboard hate, you can beat him. So it's a little hard to be good into absolutely everything at the same time, but it feels like a deck that's like pretty solid into most decks, and you can tech for some of your harder matchups here and there, and that's a pretty attractive spot to be. So that's kind of like why I ended up bringing him. On the weekend, I think the deck did really well. I guess overall, like, my CC record was 7-4 in Swiss and then 3-0 in draft. And then I lost my top 8 match. I would say that while that doesn't sound super impressive, like 2 of my losses were to Pheano, and I wasn't really teched for Pheano, and those kind of feel like maybe more on like the deck construction piece than like the deck itself. And then a lot of my other losses felt relatively close. Like my game into Azalea felt really, really close. There was a dash lost where I just kind of got high rolled and didn't draw any of my good cards either. So, I mean, like those games just happen. So overall, I was like quite happy with the deck, and I felt like it was doing a lot of powerful things. And despite the record not seeming super impressive, I walked away pretty impressed with the deck, and it's maybe one I will continue to play in the future and work on. We'll see. I'm not sure.
All right. So you already covered why you chose Boltyn for the tournament. So let's, before we jump into the mistakes, cover your deck list briefly here to make it more understandable for the viewers how your strategy was working. So what was your core strategy with the deck?
So the deck is set up primarily as a aggressive Raiden list. Boltyn is sort of looking, when you're playing Raiden Boltyn, you're looking to be an aggressive deck, but you do have a little bit of a setup element because you have your soul, which is a key resource that you can use to give your attacks go again, so long as their attack is higher than the base. A lot of what you're doing early is trying to set up soul. You often want to get to, like, if you can get to 2 soul, you're usually pretty comfortable. That opens up a lot of lines. Like 2 to 3 soul is really, really good. So you're often trying to kind of get to that 2 to 3 soul and then kind of like keep the ball rolling and have that soul buffer. Once you have soul, you're able to start giving things go again and have a lot of action points and present multiple on hits. So the deck has 3 snatch in the sideboard and 6 bolt of courage. So you're effectively running like 9 snatches. You have command and conquers in there. You have cadaverous contraband. Lumina Ascension also adds on hits to your weapons. So you really are trying to just go wide, present multiple on hits that are hard to block because of Boltyn's hero ability giving them +1. And that's a lot of what the deck is trying to do. I guess like a really key card in the deck, to nobody's surprise, is Lumina Ascension. That card is really, really powerful. And often you're kind of trying to get to that 2 to 3 soul so that, if you have 3 soul, you attack with something, you give it go again, you're down to 2 soul, you Lumina Ascension, you need to give Lumina go again, so then you're down to 1 soul, and then maybe you get soul back with Lumina from the on hit. But you kind of need a couple soul, because if you only have 1 soul and you try to Lumina Ascension, you won't be able, if they block the first one, you're just well, I don't have any soul left. So you can really kind of run into trouble. So you just need to make sure you have enough soul that even if they block, you can keep going wide and getting go again. And often once you kind of get the first Lumina Ascension, it gives you soul it kind of keeps your soul rolling. You're able to kind of keep your soul buffer and then play into your next Lumina and so on. So there's a lot of sort of managing the soul that is important in the deck.
And tell us more about your weapon choice, because you are running the Switch style. We have 2 Centauri Sabers, and then, like you already explained, the Raiden.
Yeah, so I think that right now Raiden is where you want to be. Trying to present combo is very, very powerful in certain matchups, but trying to present combo into decks with a lot of disruption, so Azalea, Uzuri, Bravo, is not really where you want to be, because you're kind of reliant on setting up towards this, I have 2 Lumina Ascensions, I get to keep my whole hand, and I get to hit you really, really hard. But Azalea and Uzuri can potentially give you inertia tokens or threaten your arsenal with Command and Conquer. Bravo can also do this. And they also just have disruption. If you're playing towards your big Lumina turn and you're ready for your pivot, and then you get hit by a red in the ledger, or you get hit by a Spinal Crush, or you get crippling crushed and you discard your Lumina Ascension, it's not great. Into these disruptive decks, you just can't really afford to play combo, and into Dromai, you can't really give them so much space where you're just playing combo. They'll just play a bunch of dragons and kind of run you over. You need the pressure of Raiden. So I think that Raiden is sort of the default weapon. And I think there's a question of if you want to include the combo at all. It's something that you could look at cutting depending on what you're expecting. The biggest reason to include the combo is for ninjas, in particular Katsu. I really like the combo. I think into Fi, I like Raiden a little bit more. And then into Boost Dash, the combo is also really, really good. So if you're in the dark and you don't know, are they a Tree Frog Dash or whatnot, you can play Raiden and you're pretty good. Raiden's really good into the defensive dash strategies and respectable into the Boost Dash, but the combo is actually very good into Boost Dash. You just tend to be... They don't really have enough ways to interact with you, and you tend to go pretty fast. Just make sure that if you're playing into Boost Dash, you protect your equipment. That's kind of the main thing. You don't want to block with your courage early, because if they T-bone you afterwards, you're very sad. So use it on your last turn, not the first one. But yeah, that's sort of the weapon choice. So it's do you want extra points into those matchups? And also the mirror, actually. The combo is very favored into the mirror. Yeah, it's sort of like a 4-card sideboard package. The courage, the 2 sabers, and the gallantry gold, and it gives you pretty big advantage into those matchups. But if you're not expecting those, or you're wanting to respect other matchups more, you could cut them for other sideboard options as well.
And to all the viewers who are still wondering what the combo is all about and how the basics with Boltyn are looking out, we have a basics video on the channel with Josh, who covers really the baseline of the deck. So everybody that is still have a lot of questions about what you just said, maybe this video will help you. But now let's keep on going with the important part of the video, which is actually the biggest mistakes that you can run into when going off with Boltyn. So what is your experience on the mistakes?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things is that you kind of, we mentioned that Boltyn wants to go wide and do a bunch of actions, and that his hero ability is really good for that. But one of the big things that you can run into is that some of your attacks, like Bolt of Courage, is a 3-for-0 charge, and at its baseline, you can't give that attack go again, because it doesn't get power higher than his base on its own. So you need some way to... And opponents can potentially just no-block that and then pass, and you're kind of sunk. So you need ways to get go again, and you need ways to kind of guarantee that go again if you can. There's a number of ways in the deck. So you have a bunch of attack reactions that help with this. So often having those attack reactions, if you get an arsenal, it's very good. You also have courage tokens. So I think that ending on a courage is a real big basic of this deck. If you can end your turn with a courage token, it's really good, because on your next turn, your Bolt of Courage or whatever starter will have +1, and you always know you can give that attack go again, and then you're kind of off to the races. But if you don't have that courage, they can choose not to interact with you. So the biggest thing is kind of making sure you always try to give yourself access to go again. And maybe related to this is managing your equipment. So you have 2 equipment that help you with this kind of problem that you have. And those are, of course, Snapdragon Scalers. Very, very good. Boltyn's like a little bit funny. When you cash in snaps, you can use it to sort of ensure that you have go again when you need to, but you can also use it to kind of get go again without spending a soul, and sometimes to go into like a early Lumina when you're like, maybe you have like only 2 soul and you're a bit worried about running out of soul for your Lumina combo, or just your regular Lumina with Raiden. You can use snaps to help kind of like cheat on 1 soul, and that can be very good as well. So managing your snaps and kind of understanding like how much soul you have and if you can afford to use it here is really important. But if you're able to save it, it's a really big asset, because then you have less chance of like kind of bricking and not having go again later in the game. So that's sort of the trade-off. And similarly, Warband of Bologna is the new headpiece. It has Temper 2. Usually you want to block with this card before you use it, but Warband is also kind of like another consistency piece, and really understanding when to use this is important. One of the nicest things about Warband is you can pay 2 to activate it, and then your next attack will charge. And if you charge a yellow, you draw a card. Commonly, the way that I'm using this is on Raiden. Not always, but you often can use this on Raiden. Attack with Raiden and charge, so it will go up to the 3 attack, and then you can give Raiden go again because it has attack higher than its base. So Warband is like a really good way to kind of insulate against not having either go again because you don't have something higher than its base, or not having a charger. Again, just kind of like managing your equipment and making sure that you're always trying to, as much as you can, like roll over like the attack reaction in Arsenal, the take flight in Arsenal, different ways to get go again, courage at the end of your turn, and then using your equipment when you need to, but trying to conserve it as much as possible so that you kind of don't run into trouble later on in the game. And then, of course, the farther and farther you get into the game, the more you can be willing to cash it in, because you're not expecting the game to go as many turns. So there's a lot of like, I think the more you play the deck and the more you think about it, you'll get kind of used to managing that equipment and making sure that you're saving it for insurance for long enough, but then also cashing it in to get value out of it before the game ends. You want both of those to be true, because if they're unused at the end of the game, that's not ideal either. Yeah, so I guess kind of related to this idea of managing your equipment and managing your go again is managing your soul. The soul is Boltyn's most important resource, because it allows you to give things go again. It allows you to play Beacon of Victory to tutor your deck, usually for Illumina Ascension. And it even can allow you to do things like use Celestial Cataclysm as a 7/0 go again. Managing your soul throughout the game is really, really important, and making sure that usually you want to have 1 soul at the end of your turn if you can help it. And if you really have to go to 0 soul, ideally you still have snaps up so that you can kind of get back online with your soul. But usually that is the case, that you want to end up 1 soul, on at least 1 soul, and you're kind of constantly balancing like, what am I trying to do here? Am I trying to build up my soul and save it so that I can get to maybe 2, 3, 4 soul and have a really, really big explosive turn? Or is the game going pretty quick and I don't expect it to last that much longer, so I should be cashing in my soul where I can and maybe spend a soul to get the Raiden swing in. So you're constantly kind of evaluating like, how many turns do you think the game is going to go? And are you going to have time to build up to a really big turn, or do you need to start cashing in your soul now? And managing that is really, really important. So I think like the biggest mistake you can make is either building up soul, and then ending the game with 5 soul and being like, well, I have all this wasted, because those are cards from your hand, and it's all wasted if you don't make use of it. But on the flip side, if you are constantly just, as soon as you get a soul, cashing it in for Raiden, you can miss out on some of the really big explosive things that Boltyn can do. So you're always trying to kind of balance this, and it's related to how long you expect the game to go, or how many more turns you think there are. Another tip I have, or common mistake to avoid, is that we kind of talked about it, but you really are playing towards these big turns in Boltyn. You're A lot of your 2-card hands aren't that impressive. Like you go take like 3 cards, you go pitch a card, take flight, raid in. You're coming in for 7, you go +1 soul, but like it's not that exciting. Even if you go a Beaming Bravado charged, it comes in for 3 and it gets +1 because you charge a yellow. You give it a go again, you raid in. It's like a 2-card 7. It's fine, but it's not like for constructed, that's not super, super exciting. So really you are trying to, at some point, play towards these big turns, and that usually involves Lumina Ascension or V of the Vanguard and going wide with lots of chain links. So you really are trying to play this setup game where you have a big turn, and that big turn kind of pulls you ahead, and that lets you kind of take over the game. So a lot of Boltyn is managing and making sure that you actually have like the life total and the soul and maybe the equipment to block an on hit so that you can take that big turn when you get it. And managing all of your resources to play towards these big turns is really, really important. One of the things you can run into sometimes with the deck is like you can blow all your Luminas early to try and get tempo and make them block, and then just sort of wind up in a spot where, well, they blocked out my Lumina, I didn't push any damage, I'm at 0 soul, and like, yeah, I have tempo, but I can't really convert it, and they have too much life, and I've gone through 2 of my Luminas, they're still at 33 life, like that's actually really bad for me. It can be kind of hard to close the game. It's not to say you can never use a Lumina for tempo. Sometimes you do want to, especially if the game is going quick and they're taking damage. But just make sure that you are not blowing all of your resources, because if you just kind of play hand-to-hand a little bit too much, Boltyn can sort of run out of gas. So you're kind of, yeah, the more defensive they're playing, the more you want to set up. The less defensive they're playing, the more you want to play hand-to-hand, and you're kind of trying to balance that at all times. I think those are sort of the biggest mistakes that I would see with Boltyn, is just managing your equipment so you always have go again, and managing like your arsenal and such so you always have go again. Managing your soul, making sure you play towards those big turns, and balance when you're converting your soul to damage now versus in the future. And then finally, make sure that you don't play hand-to-hand too much, but don't be afraid to do it if it's an aggro race and the game's really close and you need to. So there's a lot of kind of like figuring out how much to commit now versus how much to set up for later. And I think that balance is like one of the most fun things with Boltyn and one of the biggest things to learn with the deck.
A good way to follow up on the mistakes you mentioned is looking at the stream from the Realm Rumble, because then you can actually see some of those in action and follow those along. So definitely check that one out. I will link it down in the description. And now that you covered the biggest mistakes, what can you actually on top for certain matchups that you also faced at the Realm Rumble? So we want to cover Dromai, Bravo, Azalea, and also Pheano. Let's go over each of these heroes and see like what can happen in those matchups that players need to avoid.
Absolutely. Starting with Bravo. I think that into Bravo, you want to be bringing Raiden, and if the Bravo is just blocking, you do need to set up towards big turns. But in general, I think that this matchup is actually quite good for Boltyn. And the biggest tips I have is, number one, try to arsenal your D-Reacts when you can. That allows you to kind of block out his big attacks. If he takes a bunch of damage and you're able to just block with a D-React, maybe a little bit of equipment to stop the crush effect, and then keep pushing damage, it's one of the ways you can pull ahead. And don't set up too much into Bravo. He has a lot of ways to end your turn, and you don't really want to wind up in a spot where he just gets to like start crippling crush, starstrucking for free. You want to make him take damage or use equipment to do that pivot. And he can only do that so many times before he's kind of like out of defensive resources, and then suddenly has to deal with your Boltyn ability all the time, which is actually really good against Bravo because almost all of his cards are attacks. He does have some non-attacks, but it's relatively few. They're quite limited in the deck. Don't set up too much. Be willing to play hand-to-hand, and just be conservative with your armor and your D-Reacts and make sure that you save them for when it really counts. Sometimes it's okay to like take a crush effect and just play a small hand, set up something like a, what is it called? Spirit of Irina, the necklace that lets you play Lumina at instant speed. That's totally fine. Or set up a V for Valor, which is an aura that stays on the board and lets you charge at instant speed. That's really good into your slow matchups. And just sometimes, like, if you're not going to have that good of a turn, even if after using all your equipment, it's okay to just sort of take some damage, play a setup turn, and slow the game down a little bit, and then kind of put your foot back on the gas the following turn. Into Bravo, just keep up pressure, keep up tempo, and understand that you're probably going to pull ahead gradually, so long as you're careful with your equipment and you kind of bide your time well. I guess next we can talk about Dromai. Into Dromai, you really do need to be the aggressor and you want to pressure them as much as possible. You can clear their board, and sometimes you should, especially if you can get like Snatch or Bolt of Courage value for it. You want to be doing that. But really, you want to be mostly clearing the key dragons, so that's Chroma, Kyloria, and of course like a Dominia if they have it. And you don't want to be spending too much time on the other dragons. Miragai is like, sometimes you can, sometimes you won't. It depends. Like earlier in the game, the more you want to clear it. Later in the game, the less you want to clear it. But usually your primary goal is to try and get them low quickly and make them start having to block. And Lumina Ascension, again, is like a big part of this. You're trying to get each of your Luminas, it will be like part of how you push down their life total, and you're trying to make sure that you can get them to 0 after you've played all 3 of them, essentially. So into Dromai, I think the biggest mistake you can make is just playing a little bit too defensively and just like sitting there and only clearing dragons. You can do this for a little bit to play towards your big setup turns. Like often if you're just building up your soul, clearing their board and applying a little bit of pressure is okay. But you really do want to be playing towards these big hands that can pressure them and kind of get them dead before the game goes on too long. If you just take forever, Dromai is going to build up too big of a board and you get run over. So you really do need to kind of quickly set up those turns and pressure them. Another mistake that I see is, and I think it's part of the reason Dromai is a hard matchup, is that while you do want to be the aggressor, early in the game, you also need to clear the dragons. So it's like a sliding scale of like the earlier it is in the game, the more attacks that dragon's going to get and the more valuable that is, and the more you need to kill those dragons. And then as you get further and further into the game, there's going to be less future turns. Like maybe they only have 2 turns left with that dragon. So instead of the Azvalai representing like 12 damage over 4 turns, it represents 6 damage over 2 turns, and you're more willing to let that live. So there's often this sliding scale of like, when do you clear dragons, when do you not? And that is one of the harder things to learn in the matchup, but it's definitely worth thinking about and reflecting on after your game. Think about how much damage did this dragon deal? Should I have cleared it earlier, or did it do kind of an acceptable amount of damage? Because if you look back and you took, like I've had games where I take 20 damage from one dragon and it's like, well, probably should have killed that dragon, but sometimes it's easier to see in hindsight than in the moment. So that's part of the reason it's worth kind of reviewing your games. Even if you're not watching a video, just think back through the turns. Next up, Azalea. Azalea is tough. I actually lost to Brody twice. One of my games was very close. One of the games was not very close. I don't know. I'm not 100% sure how good or bad of a matchup this is. I haven't played it quite as much as I would like. I think that Boltyn can get there though. The biggest tips for Azalea is, like Bravo, Arsenal the D reacts when you can. And because she has things like Red in the Ledger, you want to try and empty your arsenal and just like push whenever you get the chance. So if you have the chance to present damage, you probably want to be presenting damage, because otherwise you're just giving her more time to find Red in the Ledger and sort of lock you out of the game. Azalea can really kind of lock you out of the game with things like Red in the Ledger and even Sleep Dart sometimes. You're often wanting to make sure that you play out your arsenal and play your cards when you get the chance to, rather than set up, so that you don't wind up in a spot later where you eat like a dominated Red in the Ledger with an inertia and you lose all your cards. By emptying your arsenal, you give yourself the chance to, maybe block with a card, attack and charge, and then arsenal a card and use most of your hand. And that's usually what you're trying to do against Azalea, is just make sure you can always convert as many cards as possible. And you need to play very aggressively in this matchup to try and end it quickly, because again, the more time they have to draw codexes and find their Red in the Ledger is usually the worse that the matchup gets for you. So you're very much trying to race and push through. So that's kind of the Azalea matchup. And then you also wanted to talk about Kano, right?
Yes, let's talk about Kano.
So I think for the Kano matchup, if you really want to be good into Kano, you need Spell Void. He's pretty naturally strong into Boltyn because he has all 3 block non-attack actions in his deck, so he doesn't turn on Boltyn's ability. And even though he has 30 life, that's like more than enough. Like he has more than enough time to kind of find his combo and kill you. You are running no blues, So you don't have that much ability to AB. Even if you have more AB in the list, you just don't have that many resources. And you also need some time to ramp up your soul, like we talked about, before you can push in, which gives him time. Like the fact that you're an aggressive deck that needs to set up a little bit before you get going doesn't line up well into Kano. So the biggest thing that you can do is have Spell Void or something similar in your list to prevent the Wildfire combo and sort of give you the time that you need to set up something big. I think that the best piece that you can include into Kano is Halo of Illumination. That gives you access to Spell Void 2 in the head slot and can also be played in combo potentially if you like. In addition to that, you can consider something like the Radiant Flow. So those are the Radiant Boots. You can spend a card in Soul to prevent the next 2 damage, and that also works against Arcane. So between Halo and Radiant Flow, you would have 4 Spell Void, and that would be probably like the biggest thing you can do. You probably want Arcane Barrier 1 in the glove slot because you want a little bit of AB from the, like when they're trying to chip you and just play turn to turn, you can pitch a yellow, stop 2 damage kind of thing if they have two spells. So being able to do that is nice, but not too much. And then in the chess piece, we were running, what is it called? Soulbond Resolve, which gives you whenever you've charged, it will prevent the first damage dealt that turn, which can be quite nice in the combo and for passively preventing damage on your turn. So this is kind of what I was trying, but I also know that Josh Lau kind of reached out on Twitter and mentioned that he really liked running the Halo, but Courage of Bladehold in the chess piece so that you can kind of like, that makes your, and run sabers into them. So then you can sort of do like a mini combo Boltyn and push through with like a double Lumina or single Lumina and really apply pressure that way. So just getting like the explosive zero, what do you call it? The zero resource saber swings is like a good way to speed up your matchup into them. And I haven't tried that myself, but it's something that I will explore in the future. And I know that Ellie tried it in the 10K and said that it was quite good. Yeah, one of those 2 chess pieces. But the biggest thing going forward is if you want to respect Kano, I think as a baseline, you need at least Nullrune Gloves and Halo, and possibly Radiant Flow as well if you really want to hammer that matchup. I think without those, you are just a little bit too slow, and that's kind of what I was running to in my Kano matches. Was I just gave Kano too much space, and it was just too hard to pressure him.
All right, so now that you've covered some of the matchups that Boltyn can run into today's meta, is there at the end a bonus tip left that you can give to all the Boltyn players watching?
I think my biggest bonus tip would be V for Valor is really, really good. This is a card that I kind of overlooked, and it's a card that into your slow matchups, I think you really want to be trying to resolve, and it just gets better and better the later the game goes. Having the onboard instant speed charge is incredible and can put your opponent in these sort of like no-win scenarios, especially with Tunic Cup. So one of my favorite play patterns is doing something like Raiden swinging for 0, and you have a Tunic up, and you have 1 card in hand, and you can either Tunic charge at instant speed to make the Raiden come in for 5, or if they block 5, or block with 2 cards, you can arsenal the card and you haven't given up anything. Similarly, you can do the same idea with something like a Command and Conquer, or even a Snatch, where you can attack with a Snatch, 1 card in hand. If they block it with 2 cards for 6, V for Valor will push it to 6, and then Boltyn's ability will push it to 7, and you'll draw a card. And you can potentially like Raiden swing as well if you like. And if they overblock it for more than that, you can just go, okay, well, you've overblocked it. I'm just going to arsenal this card, and all I've given you was a Snatch, and you've committed like 2 cards and an equipment or something like that. Same idea with Command and Conquer. You can throw a Command and Conquer for 6, threatening to pump it up to +2 for 8. And you can just put them in this really awkward spot of like, do you want to give me 3 cards for my Command and Conquer and let me arsenal this card? Or do you want to eat my Command and Conquer and then I'm going to Raiden you afterwards? Yeah, pairing V for Valor with Tunic is just really, really powerful, and just having the option to activate it and pump and charge after they've decided all their blocks and you have all the information is really, really powerful. And I think if it's a card you haven't tried, you should definitely give it a shot, because into those slower matchups where you might need to set up a little bit more, like Bravo, you'll need to set up a little bit, and Dromai, you'll need to set up a little bit. Pheano really, really shines and can put them in these really awkward spots where they just can't afford to block you that well.
So after this bonus tip, if any viewer still is hungry for more informations on Boltyn, we do have a matchup guide with Josh on the channel too, but Pheano was also recording an on-location deck profile with you, so I will link it down in the description too. And here at the end, Yuki, I really want to say thank you for you taking the time coming on Tales of Wraith again, talking about Flesh and Blood, about Boltyn, and giving us your insights from the tournament.
Thanks so much for having me, Alex. It's a pleasure as always, and thanks to all the viewers for sticking around and watching. I hope you found it helpful.